Story, the enemy, is about a Japanese doctor named Dr. Sadao, who is stuck between two things that he believes in: love for his country and his profession as a doctor. Now, he is a renowned surgeon who had been educated in America, all right? And now, as a doctor, he has taken the Hippocratic oath, which states that if a patient can be saved by a doctor, then he or she has to do their best. They cannot just ignore a patient. But what happens one time is, under certain conditions, an injured American US soldier lands under his care. Now, the dilemma here is Japan was at war with the US at that time. So, speaking clearly, that injured American soldier is his enemy. So, the only thing he can do is to hand him over to the authorities. But as a doctor, he knows that if he doesn't treat this man will die. All right? So what the struggle he goes through, all the decisions that he ends up making is what this chapter is comprised about. You may be intimidated by seeing the length of the chapter, but this is a very simple and interesting story about a man and his morality. All right? Now we begin The Enemy by Pearl S. Buck. Now there's a paragraph given in italics at the very beginning which starts before you read. It is the time of the World War. An American prisoner of war is washed ashore in a dying state and is found at the doorstep of a Japanese doctor. Should he save him as a doctor or hand him over to the army as a patriot? So just like I said, two things that he is balancing his morality on. Dr. Sadao Hoki's house was built on a spot off the Japanese coast where as a little boy he had often played. The low square stone house was set upon rocks well above a narrow beach that was outlined with bent pines. As a boy, Sadao himself, on his bare feet, as he had seen men do in the South Seas when they climbed for coconuts, his father had taken him often to the island of those seas, and never had he failed to say to the little brave boy at his side, "Those islands yonder, they are the stepping stones to the future for Japan." "Where shall we step from them?" Sadao had asked seriously. "Who knows?" his father had answered. "Who can limit our future? It depends on what we make it." So, this chapter begins with a description of Dr. Sadao Hoki's house, all right, and it is built off the coast, meaning a house is there on the shore and the sea, all right. And this is the place where he grew up as a boy, and this is the place from where his father used to give him teachings about the future of Japan. So he had been brought up in a very disciplined household. Sadao had taken this into mind as he did everything his father said. His father, who never joked or played with him, but soon spent infinite pains upon him, who was his only son. Sadao knew that his education was his father's chief concern. For this reason, he had been sent at 22 to America to learn all that could be learned of surgery and medicine. He had come back at 30. And before his father died, he had seen Sadao become famous, not only as a surgeon, but as a scientist. Because he was perfecting a discovery which would render wounds entirely clean, he had not been sent abroad with the troops. Also, he knew there was some slight danger that the old general might need an operation for a condition for which he was now being treated medically. And for this possibility, Sadao was being kept in Japan. So his father never joked around with him, never played with him, but then he loved him because he was his only son. and he did not leave any efforts to give him the best of education, and that is the reason why at the age of 22 he was sent to America to become a doctor, to learn about medicine. He spent 8 years there and he came back when he was 30, and before Sadau's father died, he successfully saw Sadao as a very well-known and a skilled surgeon. Not only a surgeon, Sadao was also a scientist. And even though the countries were at war, the situation was a world war, Sadao was not sent to the war. Normally doctors are also sent, right, to treat the injured soldiers and all. But Sadao was kept at Japan, and there was basically two reasons for it. Reason number one being, Sadao, being a scientist, he was conducting experiments. And one such experiment was, if it was successful, it would treat wounds clean. Alright? Normally wounds are okay when you walk out time, infection it used to go bad. So he was doing an experiment which would, if successful in creating the medicine, it would clean the wound entirely so that no infection would take place. That was reason number one. Reason number two was that Japan's old general was not feeling well. Alright, the leader of the army was not feeling well, and he could require surgery any moment. Alright, there wasn't any certainty about that. He may require surgery, he may not require surgery. But if he did require surgery, Sadao was the best surgeon in Japan and he had to be present. That is why he was not sent to the war. Clouds were rising from the ocean now. The unexpected warmth of the past few days had at night drawn heavy fog from the cold waves. Sadao watched mists hide outlines of a little island near the shore and then come creeping up the beach below the house. Writhing around the pines, in a few minutes, fog would be wrapped about the house too. Then he would go into the room where Hannah, his wife, would be waiting for him with the two children. So he was looking at the sea line, alright, clouds are coming up, and very soon everything would be covered in mist. And now he was thinking about going inside to his wife Hannah and his two children. But at this moment the door opened and she looked out, a dark blue woolen houri over a kimono. She came to him affectionately and put her arm through him as he stood, smiled and said nothing. He had met Hannah in America, but he had waited to fall in love with her until he was sure she was Japanese. His father would never have received her unless she would have been pure in her race, and wondered often whom he would have married if he had not met Hannah. And by what luck he had found her in the most casual way, by chance literally, at an American professor's house. The professor and his wife had been kind people, anxious to do something for their new few foreign students, and the students, though bored, had accepted this kindness. Sadao had often told Hannah how nearly he had not gone to Professor Harley's house that night. The rooms were so small, the food so bad, the professor's wife so voluble. But he had gone, and there he had found Hannah, a new student, and had felt he would love her if it were at all possible. So as he was thinking about his wife and child, out came the wife wearing traditional Japanese dress. Alright, she stood by his side lovingly and affectionately. And now Sadao starts thinking about how he had met Hannah, and yet how he had liked Hannah at the first instant, but he waited till he made sure that she was Japanese. Alright, she was pure breed Japanese, because his father was very strict and would never allow him to marry a non-Japanese girl. And he met her in America at a certain Professor Harley's house. Alright, though the professor's house was very small, his wife was very loud, yet they went there because they were kind. Alright, they were kind people, Professor Harley and his wife. They wanted to make sure that few of the foreign students that they had felt at home, alright? Because racism was always there, it still is, and back then it was even more so, alright? Also, the few Japanese students that were there in America were treated very kindly by Professor Harley and his wife. And that is where he had met Hannah. And after finding out that she was in actual Japanese, they came back and married off in traditional Japanese way. Now he felt her hand on his arm and was aware of the pleasure it gave him. Even though they had been married years enough to have the two children, for they had not married heedlessly in America. They had finished their work at school and had come home to Japan. And when his father had seen her, the marriage had been arranged in the old Japanese way. Although Sadao and Hannah had talked everything over beforehand, they were perfectly happy. She laid her cheek against his arm. So they started thinking about how they got married. And they didn't get married in America, right? They completed their studies. They came back. Sadao introduced Hannah to his father. His father approved, and they were married in the traditional Japanese way. So everything was well thought over. It was at this moment that both of them saw something black come out of the mist. It was a man. He was flung up on the ocean, flung, it seemed, to his feet by a breaker. He staggered a few steps, his body outlined against the mist, his arms above his head. Then the curled mist hit him again. "Who is that?" Hannah cried. She dropped Sadao's arm, and they both leaned over the railing of the veranda. Now they saw him again. The man was on his hands and knees, crawling. Then they saw him fall on his face and lie there. "A fisherman, perhaps," Sadao said, "washed from his boat." He ran quickly down the steps, and behind him Hannah came, her wide sleeves flying. A mile or two away on either side, there were fishing villages. But here was only the bare and lonely coast, dangerous with rocks. The surf beyond the beach was spiked with rocks. Somehow the man had managed to come through them. He must be badly torn. They saw when they came towards him and nodded it was so. The sand on one side of him had already a stain of red soaking through. So as they were thinking about the past and looking at the future, from the mist they saw a figure approach, a figure of a man. It seemed that he had been flung by the sea, all right? It was a very rough landing. And Hannah cried out, "Who is that?" And so now they began making assumption. Who could that person be? Sadao believed that he was a fisherman because a mile or two away from the coast there were fishing villages. But then the coast near where Sadao's house was built, it was filled with rocks, all right, edgy rocks. No boat could travel there. And somehow this man was able to make through all these edgy rocks to the surface. And Sadao believed that now I know that he is badly injured, all right, because the sea line is not so smooth. And as they went towards it, they were true, all right. The man was lying there, and on one side of his body, the sand was already soaking red from all the blood that was gushing out of his body. "He is wounded," Sadao exclaimed. He made haste to the man, who lay motionless. So the man is now unconscious, all right. Now Sadao saw that he was injured, so he ran towards him to help. His face in the sand, so even his face is covered, all right. He fell face first on the beach. An old cap stuck on his head, soaked with seawater. He was in wet rags of garments. Sadao stopped Hannah at his side and turned the man's head. They saw the face. "A white man," Hannah whispered. Yes, it was a white man. The cap fell away, and there was his wet yellow hair, long, as though for many weeks it had not been cut. And upon his young and tortured face was a rough yellow beard. He was unconscious and knew nothing that day. So now they realized that this is actually an enemy soldier. He's a white man. All right. And when the cap was removed, even his hair was yellow. His hair was a bit long, indicating that his hair had not been cut in a while. His face looked as if he had been tortured, indicating the fact that he is, in actual, a prisoner of war. He has somehow escaped. And as they were helping him, I am sure that the prisoner doesn't even realize that they were helping him because he was unconscious. Now Sadao remembered the wound, and with his expert fingers, he began to search for it. Now suddenly Sadao remembered that there was a lot of blood at the side, which means that this man is injured. All right, he needs to find the wound. Blood flowed freshly at his touch. On the right side of his lower back, Sadao saw that a gun wound had been reopened. The flesh was blackened with powder. Sometime not many days back, the man had been shot and had not been tended. It was a bad chance that the rock had struck the wound. "Oh, how he is bleeding," Hannah whispered in a solemn voice. The mist screened them now completely. Gone home, and even the chance beachcombers. The fishermen had gone home, and even the chance beachcombers would have considered the day at an end. So now, as they were tending to the wound, Sadao realized that the blood that was coming out was from an old bullet wound. All right, it wasn't a fresh wound. He was shot a few days back, and somehow the wound must have closed up. But while negotiating the rocks which were lying along the coast, the wound had reopened. Thankfully, no other soul was there except Sadao, his wife, and the injured soldier, because it was already dark. And all the fishermen had returned to their respective houses. And even the chance beachcombers would have considered the day at an end. All right. So we stop here for today, and we will continue